we're introducing a new way to interact with your notebook.
In the 7 years Touch Bar existed, I went through 3 MacBooks. I've been on Mac since 2012, and before that, I never played them this often. Me and my Macs always got along. These 3, we didn't. Touch Bar was a failure for me, no question about it. I was sure of this, and in my recent video about Ternus, I just mentioned it in passing as one of Apple failures, and I got a wave of comments under that video that I didn't expect. I didn't know this was a popular opinion, so I started digging, at first out of curiosity, just because I was genuinely surprised. But the further I went, the clearer it became. This story is far more interesting and layered. The story of its creation, the hate, the cancellation, and the posthumous love, one of the most dramatic stories in the modern Apple design history. And here's the thing, its main author, and also its killer, is now the future CEO of Apple. His approach to this story says a lot about what Apple will be like going forward. Innovation for the sake of innovation. That's what I thought in 2016 looking at all this. And I was wrong, because Touch Bar was actually one of the Apple's most ambitious projects of the past decade. It tackled a problem many had through before Apple, the problem of the keyboard itself. The keyboard is technologically a very old control. The QWERTY layout was invented in 1873 for the typewriter. The F1 to F12 function row settled in the 80s. The keyboard has barely changed since. And Apple has a history of pushing changes even in such a conservative part of computers. Specifically, the key with this symbol, a very successful example of improving ergonomics and breaking through familiar patterns. We have a separate video about it. If you try to set aside the familiarity of keyboard and look at it with fresh eyes, it's a pretty strange object. On one surface, letters, numbers, system commands, media controls, language switching, special characters, all in the same format, physical buttons of the same side, almost everything. It's convenient out of habit, but if you actually think about it, volume and brightness are far more logical to adjust with a knob. Scrolling wants a wheel, drawing wants a pressure-sensitive surface. Typing, fine, typing genuinely wants keys. That's one thing the keyboard got right. The rest is the same plastic square pretending it can be anything. In the 2000s, different companies tried to solve this. Russian designer Lebedev made the Optimus Maximus, where each key had its own mini-screen. Microsoft showed the adaptive keyboard in 2010. Lenovo put an adaptive function row in the ThinkPad X1 Carbon in 2014. None of them took off. All this time, Apple was working on it internally and stacking up patents. And in 2016, an OLED strip appeared in the place of F key row. Under the strip, a separate chip with its own operating system and its own security zone. The selling point that was supposed to set it apart from competitors' attempt was the built-in Touch ID. The project's codename inside Apple was Bridge. A bridge between touch input, which has lived only on iPhone and iPad for 10 years, and macOS, which had never been touch. A bridge between Apple Silicon ARM chips and Intel Macs. The chip running Touch Bar was called T1, essentially a variant of the Apple Watch chip with security enclave inside. And in 2016, under that narrow OLED strip, Apple Silicon entered the Mac for the first time, 4 years before M1. An year before Apple even publicly talked about the transition. T1 ran everything at once, drew pixel on the strip, processed Touch ID, encrypted fingerprints and secure enclave, drew Apple Pay dialogues independently of macOS. It was new category of hardware in the Mac. Everyone who mattered at Apple at the time worked on this project. Johnny Ive's team handled industrial design, Alan Dye the interface size, Craig Federighi macOS and APIs, Phil Schiller took on the marketing rationale, and John Ternus, then VP of hardware engineering. Bloomberg would later name Ternus as one of the key people who pushed Touch Bar through inside the company. On October 27, 2016, at Hello Again presentation in Town Hall, Apple's last big event before Apple Park opened, before keynotes turned into pre-filmed productions, Schiller walked on the stage and said,
"Over 45 years we've been using function keys. Well, actually for the last who knows how many years, we really haven't been using them anymore. So we've mapped other functions onto these keys. We've put volume and brightness on them. But this is crazy, keeping 45-year-old technology around and mapping other things to them. Now, our design team has has taken on the challenge to move forward and say, what if we get rid of them?
In that moment, it felt like a paradigm shift, a bid for a new standard for the whole industry. Apple had taken on a problem many had approached it, and it seems like they'd finally cracked it. Which is true, but only partly. Before I get into that, though, a quick aside about a tool that reshaped how I dig through other people's UI work. This video sponsor is Mobbin. It's a library of real interfaces from apps and websites. The important part, it's not a dribble concepts or Pinterest mood boards, but screenshot of what actually ships at Revolut, Airbnb, Spotify and another 2000 tabs. As of today, over 600k screens and 140k users flows. Everything's organized into categories with proper filters by screen type, onboarding, paywall, settings, checkout. And I know many of you with a good reason don't trust AI to do design work, but almost everyone uses it for gathering and processing information. That's exactly what Mobbin MCP helps with. It's a connector that pulls the Mobbin library directly into Claude, Cursor or whatever AI environment you work in. Ask for example, show me how banks handle KYC, and you get examples from product that actually shipped. Referral link in the description. If you try and subscribe, I get a cut. MCP is in beta right now, available on paid plans. And now back to 2016. Touch Bar arrived inside a specific MacBook Pro, the 2016 model. The thinnest, the most beautiful, the most ambitious in the line history. During the keynote I was thrilled and full of anticipations. Apple did a lot first on this laptop. They removed all ports except for USB-C, birthing an entire dongle industry because professionals use a lot of peripherals. They killed MagSafe, the magnetic charger everyone loved. I personally dropped my Mac on the tile and dented it at least once when I was at hotel on vacation. With MagSafe that wouldn't have happened. These were design decisions that started irritating me immediately. Then came the technical problems. The second generation butterfly keyboard broke so often that Apple would later pay $50 million in a case action settlement. The display cable wore against the housing, FlexGate screen flickering and failure. The protective coating on display wore off in a couple of years. Personally, under official warranty across 3 MacBooks, I went through 3 bottom case replacement and 1 top case replacement. And in this environment, Touch Bar. It got lumped together with all the problems of that MacBook generation. I had so much frustration with both the technical and the design issues that Touch Bar just felt like a piece of this very flawed computer. On top of that, there was a complaint specific to Touch Bar itself. The main one, they removed the physical escape key. For programmers, the Vim community, anyone who lives in the terminal, this was completely awkward. Guides appear on how to remap caps lock to escape. Apple tried to fix it in software, expanding the touch zone under the escape icon. But the problem was specifically the lack of physical reference point. Touch Bar is flat, flush with the body. A physical button in the corners is a very clean tactile anchor for muscle memory. Second complaint, no haptic feedback. You can't use Touch Bar blind. Apple released a computer for professionals where the pro audience couldn't use function without looking. John Gruber in his first review directly asked for Taptic Engine in the next version, the pseudo-click. Apple already knew how to do it in the trackpad and iPhone. That could have at least given partial tactile feedback, which in theory might have softened the problems. But that feature never came. A year later, Marco Arment, one of the respected and recognizable developers in the Apple community, publicly gave up, refunded his MacBook with Touch Bar and bought the version with a normal F-roll. For escape, for being able to actually control the computer, for hotkeys. When I traded my first MacBook for a second with the next generation butterfly keyboard, the one that didn't break on me anymore. By then so much frustration had piled up that while trying to get used to Touch Bar, I started thinking about leaving the Apple ecosystem altogether. 7 years of Touch Bar and not a single substantial update. No new APIs, no Taptic Engine, no version 2. The T1 chip was replaced with T2 in 2018, but Touch Bar stayed exactly what it was at launch. There wasn't much to love about Touch Bar in that form. Controlling basic function like volume and brightness was still less convenient than physical buttons. The only software where the adaptation was actually done well was Apple's own Logic Pro, Final Cut and other, which was a paradox for me, because in apps where I use shortcuts the most, where people work professionally, they were asking me to look away from the screen, look at another screen, and use touch to do things I could do faster without looking away with just trackpad and hotkeys. What is the dock? It's the list of apps with current status indicators. It's something the user needs to launch an app, not while working with it. It's something there is no point of being distracted by, and that can hinder more than help by adding visual noise. Isn't it the perfect candidate to move into Touch Bar? Andreas Hagenberg, the author of the popular utility Beta Touch tool, single-handedly built what Touch Bar should have been from the start. A fully programmable strip with widgets, scripts, media controls, battery status, whatever you wanted. An open source project called POC appeared, moving the macOS dock into Touch Bar. MTMR appeared, My Touch Bar, My Rules. JSON configured maintenance by one person on GitHub for 6 years. It turned out the Touch Bar concept worked. Apple just never took it past the first prototypes. By 2022, attitude started shifting. Users who install Beta Touch tools stopped returning their machines. They started writing on forums that they couldn't upgrade because Touch Bar had become a super important part of their MacBook. Exactly what I saw in the comments under the Ternus video this spring. I had no idea anything was happening there in recent years, that people were still discussing it, that the functionality was still expanding. By that point, the problem of that MacBook generation had been solved by what was essentially a full rollback. They brought back a normal keyboard, brought back the ports MagSafe, HDMI, SD card reader, added battery life and made the laptop thicker and heavier. Of Touch Bar, only Touch ID remained, because the rollback was total. And you know, we've seen something very similar before. Microsoft released Windows XP in 2001 with the Luna interface, bright green buttons, blue taskbar, rounded corners. Half the world criticized it for looking childish. Professionals switched to the classic theme. A few years later, Microsoft moved on to Vista, learning on the first year's negative feedback. Luna went into history. About 10 years later, it turned out to be one of Microsoft's most beloved interfaces in the company's history. Microsoft just didn't hear it back then. The same thing happening with Touch Bar. At the very moment Apple decided to kill Touch Bar, something interesting was happening in the market. In 2017, Elgato released Stream Deck, a separate panel with programmable LCD buttons, originally for streamers, then for anyone working with shortcuts. In 2022, Stream Deck Plus came out with physical knobs and tactile strip. Gear wrote at the time, Stream Deck Plus is the control panel Apple's Touch Bar dream of being. In 2024, Flex Bar appeared on Kickstarter, an external OLED strip, essentially Touch Bar as a USB device, raised serious money. The market gave a direct answer. The concept was right. Video go viral on YouTube about open source projects or just Android apps used as external touch interface for computers. Touch Bar could have become a new input category, an industry standard for laptops. But they threw the baby out with the bathwater. Apple walked away from a category it had opened itself. The category lived on and kept evolving. Imagine how painful it must have been for Touch Bar main's parent, John Ternus. Oh wait, no, he was the one who made the decision to kill it. He probably okay. In a Wired interview, Greg Joswiak and John Ternus answered the why question evasively. Pro customers love the full-size tactile feel of these functional keys. Bloomberg Businessweek and Axios reported there's also a quote from Ternus calling Touch Bar his big fumble. He pushed it himself, then killed it. Recent news about winding down Apple Vision Pro development can indirectly be filled in the same category of decisions. This matters because in September 2026, Ternus becomes Apple's CEO, and his approach to Touch Bar says a lot about how he'll run the company. Ternus is a product manager to the bone. His style is iterative, attentive to data, willing to kill his own children if the numbers don't add up. He talks about this in every interview of the past few years, including the conversation with the Tom's Guide before his appointment. And this is a very important shift, completely abandoning a technology they pushed for 7 years. This is the first case in the modern Apple history where bolt removal didn't work and the company simply retreated without offering anything in return. Steve Jobs' Apple and to some extent Tim Cook worked differently, made bold bets, removed familiar things, the floppy, the optical drive, the headphone jack, got hit with a storm of criticism and pushed through, refining the solution over several generations. The iPod wasn't accepted right away. The iPhone in its first year without an app store was criticized as an unfinished product. The iPad was called a big iPhone for years. Apple lived through all of it because it had a vision and followed it. Ternus doesn't work that way, and we already see how this is changing the company. On one hand, great result, MacBook Neo is putting up incredible sales numbers. The iPhone E series appeared, affordable, high margin, smartly positioned. The base iPad and Mac Mini are perfect product solution where every decision is justified by data. In their mid-price category, all these products are simply the best you can find for the money, probably. On the other hand, iPad OS, which has been moving toward a desktop experience for years, has clearly lost its own identity. The cancellation of Touch Bar, the gradual dissolution of what used to be the conceptual part of Apple, the philosophical bets on how the industry would change. Apple used to open new categories. Now it works carefully inside ones that are already open. And there is an irony. Meanwhile, Jony Ive, the man who built conceptual Apple together with Jobs, recently presented an interface for Ferrari Luce. He hasn't unlearned how to make conceptual bets. I bring this up and as an example that this isn't about time changing, isn't about there being no room left for innovation. A reminder, Apple worked on its own car for a long time and didn't make one. And Apple claimed they were quietly but very strong on AI. Turned out not at all. This is a big conceptual loss. Apple as a business, as build quality, as efficiency hasn't gone anywhere. Apple as the concept Steve Jobs built, it seems has. At the start of this video, I said I didn't love Touch Bar, and even now, even with all these tools that extends its functionality, I think it's not for me. But I loved the Apple where a strip like that could appear and immediately be perfectly integrated into the entire software ecosystem. After every new Apple keynote, I'd eagerly head to the developer section and study the new guides, the new videos for developers and designers, because that's where the design patterns for the whole industry came from. I watched all the liquid glass material because I wanted to make a video about it. I went in with mild disappointment, but with the thought that maybe I just didn't get something. And now I'd look at the guidelines and figure it out. But no, it really did turn out to be exactly what it was. In the past, Apple held a unique status as a trendsetter that changed or even created markets with every product. And it's completely obvious that this Apple is gone. There is sadness in this, sure, but it's a bit of designer's professional grumbling. Overall, I'm happy that Apple is now cheaper and more powerful than competitors. I'm happy they have enough money for that kind of R&D. Apple is doing great and Ternus is a very talented manager who's proven it many times. I just really loved a different place of change in my profession. 20 years ago, I caught a chaotic, completely non-dynamic industry. Over the next 10 years, it became saturated, constantly changing, and then everything started settling and standardizing. And for me, used to the dynamism, that's sad. I miss Steve Jobs, and one Jony Ive isn't enough for me. But we see that few are willing to become the new Jobs, which is very understandable. That way of influencing the world carries a very high personal price. Watch my video about it. Steve Jobs' reality distortion cost him everything. That's it on Touch Bar. Bye.